Nobody inside the WNBA office expected chaos on Christmas morning. Not after the season they just survived. Not after record-breaking viewership. Not after months of telling themselves the hardest part was over. Christmas was supposed to be quiet. A pause. A reset. One day where the spotlight drifted away from women's basketball and onto the NFL, the NBA Christmas slate, or literally anything else. For a few hours, that plan worked. Then at exactly the wrong moment, everything unraveled. It wasn't a league announcement. It wasn't a trade. It wasn't even a basketball highlight. It was a Nike commercial, 32 seconds long, released without warning, dropped while most of the sports world was still half asleep. And by the time people realized what they were watching, it was already too late. Because this wasn't just an ad. It was a declaration. Inside league offices, the reaction didn't sound like celebration. It sounded like phones ringing, emails firing off, executives scrambling to understand how a single brand move had just exposed something they had spent years trying to control. This wasn't about shoes. It wasn't about marketing. And it definitely wasn't about coincidence. It was about power. And for the first time in a long time, the WNBA had lost control of the conversation. But that wasn't the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part was what the commercial quietly revealed about who actually holds leverage in women's basketball now, and who doesn't. And once fans saw it, they couldn't unsee it. At first glance, the Caitlin Clark Nike commercial looked like just another big-budget spot. Cinematic lighting, slow motion, clean visuals, confident tone. But the deeper you looked, the more unsettling it became. Because Nike doesn't make accidental decisions, especially not on Christmas Day. Exactly 40 years earlier, on December 25, 1985, Nike aired Michael Jordan's first Christmas commercial. That moment didn't just sell shoes. It launched the most powerful athlete-brand partnership in sports history. 40 years later, Nike chose the same date. Same symbolism. Same confidence. Same message hiding in plain sight. This wasn't subtle, and it definitely wasn't random. The setting alone told a story. A quiet driveway. Snow falling. A place that felt personal, grounded, almost myth-like. This wasn't about a team. This wasn't about a league. This was about origin. About destiny. About framing Caitlin Clark as something bigger than a jersey. Then came the cameos. NFL stars. Music icons. Mainstream cultural figures. Not WNBA legends. Not league history. Not a symbolic handoff. That omission mattered. Because when brands want to honor legacy, they make it visible. When they want to rewrite the hierarchy, they skip it entirely. Even more telling was what wasn't present. The WNBA logo barely appeared. League branding was minimal. No emphasis on teams. No collective framing. Nike didn't sell women's basketball. They sold Caitlin Clark. That distinction is everything. Because for decades, the WNBA has operated under one core philosophy. The league comes first. No individual star is bigger than the system. Equality is stability. Collective identity protects the league from chaos. This commercial shattered that illusion in 32 seconds. It told fans, sponsors, and players something the league never wanted said out loud. There is a center of gravity now. And it doesn't sit in the commissioner's office. But the timing made it even worse, because this didn't land in a vacuum. It landed right as the league was already struggling to keep control of its future. To understand why this commercial rattled Cathy Engelbert so deeply, you have to understand how the WNBA has been run for decades. Control has always been the priority. Not control in a villainous sense, but structural control, narrative control, financial control, the kind of centralized authority that keeps a young league from splintering under pressure. Engelbert came from the corporate world. Deloitte, boardrooms, balance sheets. She wasn't hired to be popular. She was hired to stabilize and grow an ecosystem that had always been fragile. Her philosophy has been consistent. The league must be bigger than any one player. That belief isn't abstract. It shapes everything. Salary caps, marketing strategy, media messaging, disciplinary standards. Even star treatment has limits. Because once a league allows one athlete to outgrow the structure, the leverage shifts. And when leverage shifts, negotiations change. Players stop asking. They start dictating. That's the scenario Engelbert has spent her entire tenure trying to avoid. The Nike commercial dropped like a wrecking ball into that framework. This wasn't coordinated league messaging. This wasn't approved symbolism. This wasn't a shared moment designed to lift everyone. Nike acted independently. And worse, successfully. Inside league offices, that's terrifying. Because if the most powerful sponsor in women's basketball is willing to elevate one player above the league itself, it signals something dangerous. The league may no longer be the primary value driver. Caitlin Clark's brand didn't just coexist with the WNBA in that ad. It existed outside of it. And that's the line you never want crossed. Once fans associate excitement, prestige, and spectacle with a player instead of a league, everything changes. Ticket sales become star-driven. Broadcast interest becomes personality-driven. Sponsors start asking different questions. Not, how's the league doing? But, how many Caitlin Clark games can we get? For a commissioner, that's a nightmare scenario. Because it means the system you built to protect the collective can no longer contain its biggest asset. And Engelbert knew it immediately. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't jealousy. It was survival instinct. The league had just been bypassed in its own biggest moment. And that loss of control couldn't have come at a worse time. Because just weeks earlier, Engelbert had been fighting another battle behind the scenes. One that made this Nike move feel less like coincidence and more like a direct challenge. The Nike commercial didn't just hit the WNBA front office emotionally. It hit them strategically. Because this wasn't the first time Caitlin Clark had quietly disrupted plans behind closed doors. Just weeks earlier, the league was pushing hard in another direction, the Unrivaled League. On paper, it was a solution. Founded by Breanna Stewart and Nafisa Collier, Unrivaled was designed to fix one of the WNBA's longest-standing problems, the off-season. Players leaving the country. Stars disappearing from the American spotlight. Money flowing elsewhere. This was supposed to change that. Equity-driven. Player-controlled. Built by veterans who carried the league long before the spotlight arrived. Commissioner Engelbert publicly supported it. She had to. The optics mattered. This was framed as progress, as empowerment, as proof the league was evolving. But privately, there was one name everyone kept circling, Caitlin Clark. Because no matter how strong the idea was, no matter how respected the founders were, the truth was obvious to anyone watching the numbers. Without Clark, Unrivaled was a project. With her, it was a phenomenon. So the offer came. Reports surfaced of a deal north of 7 figures for a limited commitment. A staggering number compared to standard WNBA salaries. The kind of offer designed to make saying no almost impossible. And Caitlin Clark said no. No press conference. No statement. No drama. She simply declined. She chose rest. She chose silence. She chose to step away. That decision alone rattled people. Because it exposed something uncomfortable. Clark didn't need alternative platforms to maintain relevance. The attention followed her regardless. Then Nike dropped the commercial. And whatever doubt remained evaporated instantly. Within 24 hours, that 32-second ad pulled in more engagement than Unrivaled's entire launch campaign combined. Not just views, conversation, reaction, cultural reach. The comparison wasn't fair. But it was unavoidable. The numbers spoke clearly. Caitlin Clark didn't need Unrivaled to stay visible. Unrivaled needed Caitlin Clark to matter. For league leadership, that realization landed hard. Because the Unrivaled League wasn't just a side project. It was part of a larger strategy to keep power centralized, to keep talent aligned, to ensure stars stayed within structures the league could influence. Clark stepping outside that system, unintentionally or not, exposed how thin that influence really was. Then Nike poured gasoline on it. The commercial didn't just overshadow Unrivaled. It reframed the entire off-season conversation. Instead of talking about new leagues, equity models, or player empowerment, everyone was talking about one person, one brand, one moment. And suddenly, the WNBA wasn't the platform driving the biggest story in women's basketball. It was reacting to it. That's when panic turns into pressure. Because once you lose control of timing, narrative, and momentum, everything else starts to wobble. And that wobble was about to show up somewhere the league couldn't ignore. The money. Once the emotional shock faded, reality hit even harder. Because this wasn't just a branding problem anymore. It was a money problem. A serious one. Commissioner Cathy Engelbert comes from corporate America. Deloitte. Boardrooms. Balance sheets. Optics. She understands numbers better than narratives. That's why this moment cut so deep. The Nike commercial didn't say anything about money. It didn't need to. The visuals did all the talking. A cinematic shoot, a closed-off neighborhood, A-list celebrities, custom gear, primetime holiday placement across NFL and NBA broadcasts. That 32-second spot cost more to produce than some full WNBA marketing campaigns. And everyone watching could feel it. Because right after seeing Clark drain logo threes in a snow-covered driveway, casual fans did what casual fans always do. They Googled, how much does Caitlin Clark make in the WNBA? And the answer created a problem no press release could fix. Her league salary barely registers next to what Nike, Gatorade, and State Farm are paying her. One commercial likely covered more than her entire season paycheck. That contrast is devastating for a league trying to sell parity, professionalism, and upward momentum. It quietly asks a question leadership doesn't want people asking. If one player can generate this much value outside the league, why does the league itself capture so little of it? That question matters because the WNBA is heading into critical labor conversations. Collective bargaining, revenue sharing, salary structure. This ad just handed players a visual argument stronger than any spreadsheet. You don't need charts when you can point at the screen and say, that's the money. It's just not coming from us. Owners reportedly weren't happy. Not because Clark succeeded, but because the league didn't. Nike captured the upside, the buzz, the cultural moment. The WNBA logo barely made a cameo. From an owner's perspective, that's unacceptable. You invest in teams. You fund operations. You absorb losses. And when the biggest star in your ecosystem creates a global moment, your league isn't the beneficiary. It makes the WNBA look like a middleman instead of the engine. And Engelbert knows what happens to middlemen when brands realize they don't need them. They get cut out. This also complicates negotiations internally. How do you ask veterans to accept incremental salary growth when the league's most marketable player is already operating in a completely different financial universe? How do you preach patience when one athlete has blown past the system entirely? That gap doesn't just hurt optics. It erodes authority. Because once players realize the real money exists outside league control, loyalty becomes optional. And if that sounds familiar, it should. The NBA went through this with LeBron. But this situation is even more fragile. The WNBA doesn't have decades of financial cushion. It doesn't have massive TV deals to fall back on. It doesn't have a surplus of stars who can replace the attention if one walks away. Clark isn't just a star. She's leverage. And Nike just reminded everyone where that leverage lives. That realization didn't just stay in boardrooms. It leaked into locker rooms. And that's where things started getting volatile. The most dangerous part of this entire situation didn't happen on social media. It happened quietly, inside locker rooms, because players see everything. They may not say it publicly. They may not tweet it, but they notice patterns. They notice effort. They notice who gets protected, who gets promoted, and who gets prioritized. When Caitlin Clark's Nike commercial dropped, the first reaction across the league wasn't jealousy. It was comparison. Side-by-side clips flooded timelines almost instantly. Clark's ad, cinematic, layered, expensive, culturally plugged in. Aya Wilson's ad, short, simple, forgettable to the casual eye. And that contrast became the story. This wasn't fair to Aya Wilson. Her resume speaks for itself. Multiple MVPs, championships. The most dominant player in the league by pure basketball standards. But marketing isn't about fairness. It's about investment. And the investment gap was impossible to ignore. Players started asking quiet questions. Why does one athlete get the full Michael Jordan treatment while another gets something that feels rushed? Why does one campaign feel like a long-term vision while the other feels like a box being checked? Those questions don't stay theoretical for long. They turn emotional. Because veterans have been here longer. They've carried the league through years when nobody was watching. They played through charter flight debates, low salaries, limited coverage, and constant comparison to men's sports. And now, suddenly, a rookie is being elevated in ways they never were. Not by the league, but by Nike. That distinction matters. Because when a brand values you more than the league does, resentment doesn't point outward. It turns inward. Commissioner Engelbert understands this dynamic better than anyone. She spent the last 2 seasons trying to cool tensions around physical play, flagrant fouls, and the perception that Caitlin Clark is being targeted on the court. This commercial poured fuel on that fire. Not intentionally, but inevitably. When one player is elevated publicly, others feel diminished privately. And that emotional gap has consequences. It changes how people play. It changes how hard fouls are justified. It changes how respect is given or withheld. The league's worst nightmare isn't backlash on Twitter. It's a season where veterans feel disrespected, young stars feel untouchable, and every game becomes a referendum on favoritism instead of basketball. Because once resentment takes hold, the product suffers. Not immediately, but gradually. More tension, more drama, more headlines that have nothing to do with the game. And all of it eventually lands back on the commissioner's desk. What makes this situation even more volatile is that the Nike commercial didn't just elevate Clark. It bypassed the league's internal hierarchy completely. Traditionally, WNBA marketing honors lineage. Legends matter. History matters. There's a sense of progression. You earn your place. This ad didn't follow that script. It placed Clark alongside global male celebrities, NFL stars, music icons, SNL personalities. No symbolic handoff. No acknowledgement of the old guard. No gradual transition. Just immediate elevation. That sends a message. Not just to fans. To players. It says outside validation now carries more weight than internal approval. And once that idea takes hold, the league's ability to manage egos, expectations, and unity becomes fragile. Because stars don't wait their turn anymore. They take it. And that brings us to the moment where this stops being about commercials altogether and starts being about power. At this point, the conversation stopped being about marketing. It became about authority. Because leagues don't just operate on contracts and schedules. They operate on belief. On the idea that the system is bigger than any one person. That the structure deserves loyalty because it provides opportunity. That belief cracked the moment this Nike commercial aired. Not because Caitlin Clark demanded anything, but because she didn't need to. The imagery alone did the damage. The ad framed her as self-sustaining. As someone whose value exists independent of the WNBA. Snow falling. Distance shrinking. Shots flying from anywhere. The message was subtle but unmistakable. She is not being built by the league. She has outgrown it. That's a terrifying realization for any commissioner. Because once players recognize that their individual market power outweighs institutional control, the balance shifts permanently. This wasn't the first time Engelbert felt that pressure. Months earlier, the league was already dealing with fallout from comments that rubbed players the wrong way. Remarks that were interpreted as dismissive. As if athletes should be grateful for the deals leadership negotiated on their behalf. That moment never fully went away. It lingered. The Nike commercial brought it back into focus without saying a word. It showed what gratitude actually looks like in a free market. It looks like brands paying what you're worth. It looks like leverage. And suddenly, asking players to accept slow progress, limited raises, or long-term patience feels hollow when the proof of value is playing on national television during NFL games. Authority doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes. Quietly. First, players stop internalizing league messaging. Then, they stop defending leadership publicly. Eventually, they stop aligning their interests with the institution. And that's the danger zone. Because once alignment breaks, governance becomes reactive instead of proactive. Engelbert isn't blind to this. She knows the WNBA can't afford a star-driven power struggle. The league doesn't have the financial margin for a fractured identity. But here's the problem. You can't put this back in the box. Nike made a choice. The market responded. Fans followed the star. And no memo, meeting, or media appearance can undo that. The most uncomfortable question now hangs in the air. Not whether Caitlin Clark is good for the league, but whether the league is big enough to contain her. That question terrifies executives because it introduces options. What if Clark decides her future doesn't require league approval? What if sponsors begin designing platforms around her directly? What if the WNBA becomes a stepping stone instead of the destination? That may sound extreme, but financially it's already happening. When a single commercial creates more cultural momentum than months of league planning, it exposes how fragile centralized control really is. And once fragility is visible, confidence follows it out the door. The Nike ad didn't shout rebellion. It whispered independence. And that whisper was loud enough to make leadership uneasy. Because the league now finds itself managing a reality it didn't design. And the next consequence of that reality is already forming. It's not about money. It's not about marketing. It's about what happens when the audience chooses sides. Here's the part league executives hate admitting out loud. They didn't lose control because of Nike. They lost control because of the audience. The moment the commercial dropped, fans didn't ask what the WNBA thought. They didn't wait for commentary from league insiders. They didn't look for permission to react. They chose. And they chose Caitlin Clark. The comment sections told the story immediately. Not just praise, but alignment. People weren't celebrating the league. They were celebrating her. Recreating the from anywhere shots. Quoting the lines. Sharing clips with captions that had nothing to do with teams, standings, or schedules. It was personal. That's the shift. For years, the WNBA worked to sell the idea of collective growth. Support the league. Support women's basketball. Support the mission. But this moment flipped that logic on its head. Fans weren't supporting an idea anymore. They were supporting a person. That's powerful and dangerous. Because once fans emotionally attach to an individual, the institution becomes optional. The jersey matters less than the name on the back. The logo fades behind the story. You could see it in real time. When critics questioned the imbalance, fans didn't defend the league's philosophy. They defended Clark's worth. They pointed to ratings, merchandise, sold-out arenas, social reach. They spoke the language of value, not tradition. That matters because audiences don't care about governance. They care about what excites them. And the Nike commercial didn't feel like a league moment. It felt like a cultural moment, one people wanted to participate in. And participation is the ultimate signal. Once fans start recreating your campaign without being asked, you've lost control of it. Nike understood that. The WNBA didn't. This wasn't outrage-driven engagement. It wasn't hate-watching. It wasn't controversy for controversy's sake. It was joy. It was admiration. And that's the hardest thing to counter. Because you can't discipline fans. You can't redirect organic enthusiasm. You can't tell people what they're allowed to care about. The league could release statements. Executives could give interviews. Veterans could voice frustration. None of it mattered. The audience had already moved. And when that happens, power follows attention. That's when the league's position truly weakened. Because once the crowd picks a side, neutrality disappears. You're either aligned with the momentum, or you're standing in its way. And for the first time, the WNBA found itself reacting to a wave it didn't create. That reaction hasn't fully surfaced yet. But the tension is building. And the next phase of this story won't play out in commercials. It will play out in decisions. While fans were celebrating and players were processing, a different reaction was taking place far from the cameras. Inside ownership circles. This is where the real panic started. Because owners don't think in headlines. They think in leverage, return on investment, and long-term stability. And what that Nike commercial exposed scared them more than any social media backlash ever could. It exposed dependence. For years, owners were told the same story. Grow the league slowly, protect the collective, avoid making any one player bigger than the system. That philosophy justified losses, limited salaries, and cautious expansion. But Caitlin Clark broke that logic in real time. Not through protest. Not through demands. Through market reality. When a single athlete can generate a cultural moment that eclipses league initiatives, owners are forced to ask an uncomfortable question. Are we building a league, or are we renting relevance from one star? That question matters because the answer changes everything. If the WNBA's current momentum is primarily driven by Caitlin Clark's presence, then her leverage in future negotiations becomes enormous. Not theoretical. Tangible. Ticket sales. TV ratings. Merchandise spikes. Sponsor interest. Owners see the numbers. They know which games sell out. They know which broadcasts outperform projections. And now they've seen what happens when Clark operates outside the league's promotional control. That scares them. Because it suggests a future where the league's value is no longer centralized, where one player's absence would materially damage the product. And once that risk becomes visible, owners don't panic publicly. They panic quietly. Phone calls start happening. Questions get asked behind closed doors. Strategies are reassessed. Why isn't the league capturing more of this upside? Why does Nike benefit more than we do? What happens if Clark pushes for structural changes we can't accommodate? Those aren't fan questions. Those are ownership questions. And they all point to the same looming issue. The next collective bargaining agreement. Because this commercial didn't just create buzz. It reshaped negotiation dynamics before talks even begin. Clark doesn't need to threaten anything. Her existence already proves the point. The league needs her more than she needs the league. That flips the traditional power structure upside down. Owners understand this better than anyone. They've seen it in other leagues. Once stars realize their individual value outweighs institutional constraints, concessions follow. Not immediately, but inevitably. And here's the problem. The WNBA doesn't have the margin for error the NBA had when stars took control. There's no massive revenue cushion. No billion-dollar TV deal safety net. Every decision now carries risk. Push too hard, and you alienate the star driving attention. Give too much, and you fracture parity and precedent. Either way, ownership loses something. And that's why this commercial wasn't celebrated in boardrooms. It was studied, because it didn't just market Caitlin Clark. It exposed how fragile the league's current balance really is. And that brings us to the most dangerous question of all. Not what happens next season, but what happens if the league can't keep up with the star it helped introduce to the world. This is the question no one in league leadership wants to say out loud, but it's already being asked. Quietly, privately, seriously. Is the WNBA big enough for Caitlin Clark? For years, the debate around Clark was simple. Is she good enough? Can her game translate? Can she handle the physicality? That conversation is over. The Nike commercial didn't just confirm her stardom. It reframed her scale. Everything about the From Anywhere campaign felt global. The visuals, the tone, the message. Snow, distance, isolation, confidence. It didn't feel tied to one city, one team, or even one league. It felt borderless. That's a problem for an organization still fighting for domestic stability. Because global branding introduces expectations the WNBA currently can't meet. International distribution gaps. Limited overseas scheduling. Merchandise availability issues. Broadcast reach that still lags behind demand. Fans from Europe, South America, and Asia flooded comment sections asking the same thing. Why can't I buy this merch here? Why isn't the league accessible where I live? Why does Nike seem more global than the sport itself? Those questions land on the commissioner's desk, even when they aren't technically her fault. Because perception doesn't separate brand from league. To the audience, it's all one ecosystem. And right now, that ecosystem looks mismatched. Clark's reach is accelerating faster than the league's infrastructure. That gap is dangerous. Because once a star's ambition outpaces the platform they're on, options start forming. They don't have to be spoken. They just have to exist. Could Clark build a touring exhibition model? Could a streaming giant back a player-driven series? Could sponsors create events that bypass league scheduling entirely? These aren't fantasies. They're business models. And the Nike commercial quietly validates them. When a company is willing to spend this much on a 30-second ad, it's signaling confidence in long-term return. Not just product sales, but audience loyalty. The platform doesn't matter as much as the face. That's the fear. Because once a league becomes replaceable in the value chain, its authority weakens dramatically. Engelbert understands this. She's spoken often about global expansion, future franchises, and international growth. But growth takes time. Stars don't wait. This isn't about Clark threatening to leave. It's about the league realizing it may not be the final destination anymore. That realization creates urgency. And urgency leads to mistakes. Which is why what happens next is critical. Because the next phase of this story won't be driven by Nike. It won't be driven by fans. It will be driven by how the league responds. And whether it chooses adaptation or resistance. This is the moment where leagues either evolve or lose control trying not to. Because once the power shift becomes visible, leadership has only two real options. Adapt to it or resist it. And both paths are risky. If the WNBA adapts, it means acknowledging something they've spent decades avoiding. That star power drives growth more than collective messaging ever will. It means leaning into Caitlin Clark, not just as a face of the league, but the centerpiece of its next era. That requires uncomfortable changes, reworking marketing strategy, revisiting revenue sharing, allowing individual stars to operate more freely, accepting that not every player will be promoted equally. For a league built on a quality-first philosophy, that feels like betrayal. But resisting the shift is even more dangerous. Because resistance doesn't stop momentum. It redirects it. If leadership tries to downplay Clark's impact, slow-roll her influence, or bury her within collective messaging, the audience won't follow. They'll see it as insecurity, as pettiness, as the system protecting itself instead of serving the game. Fans already proved where their loyalty sits. With the player, not the institution. The worst-case scenario for the league isn't Clark leaving. It's Clark staying while operating emotionally and commercially outside league alignment. That creates constant friction. Every endorsement becomes controversial. Every marketing decision feels political. Every on-court incident gets amplified. And all of it chips away at trust. Commissioner Engelbert is now managing an impossible balance. She has to keep veterans engaged, owners comfortable, players united, and fans satisfied, while the center of gravity keeps moving. That's why this commercial didn't just expose a problem. It forced a decision. Because the WNBA can't pretend this moment didn't happen. The audience saw it. The players felt it. The sponsors responded to it. The only question left is whether leadership will treat this as a threat or as an opportunity. Because history is clear on one thing. Leagues that fight their stars lose. Leagues that grow with them survive. And right now, the WNBA is standing at that exact crossroads. This is no longer about a sneaker commercial. That moment already passed. What remains is the fallout. Because moments like this don't disappear. They settle. They reshape behavior. They alter expectations. And they leave pressure behind that doesn't go away. Every decision the WNBA makes from here forward will be viewed through a new lens. Every marketing push. Every discipline decision. Every media appearance. Every contract negotiation. All of it will be compared to one simple question. Does this league understand the moment it's in? If leadership chooses to lean in, to treat Caitlin Clark not as a disruption but as a catalyst, the league has a chance to accelerate its growth faster than it ever has before. Sold-out arenas stop being a novelty. National broadcasts stop being experiments. Global interest stops being hypothetical. But leaning in means surrendering some control. And institutions hate that. If leadership chooses resistance instead, the consequences will be quieter but far more damaging. Fans won't revolt overnight. Sponsors won't pull out immediately. But momentum will slow. Trust will erode. And the league will once again feel like it's chasing relevance instead of shaping it. History is brutal to organizations that misread cultural shifts. We've seen it in music. We've seen it in media. We've seen it in sports. The stars always win. Not because they demand power, but because audiences give it to them. Caitlin Clark didn't ask for this moment. She didn't manufacture it. She didn't campaign for it. She earned attention through performance. Nike didn't create her influence. They responded to it. That's the truth league leadership has to confront. The From Anywhere campaign didn't expose favoritism. It exposed reality. The market already decided. The audience already decided. The money already moved. Now the league has to decide whether it wants to ride that wave or get swallowed by it. Because this isn't about one player being bigger than the WNBA. It's about whether the WNBA can become big enough to hold her. And the answer to that question will shape the future of women's basketball for the next decade. If you want real breakdowns like this, where money, power, and basketball collide, make sure you're subscribed to Basket Now. We don't follow narratives. We break them down. Drop a like if this opened your eyes, comment what you think the league should do next, and stay locked in, because this story is far from over.